I realized my daughter-in-law hated me the moment I walked into their new house and saw an entire wall of family photographs without a single picture of me anywhere. I stood in the front entryway holding a lemon pie I had baked that morning, still warm beneath the dish towel wrapped around it, while guests drifted past me carrying wine bottles and gift bags. The house smelled like fresh paint, vanilla candles, and expensive hardwood polish. Claire had always cared about appearances. Even before she married my son, she used words like aesthetic and curated as if life itself were a magazine spread. "Margaret," she called brightly from the kitchen island, her voice sweet enough to fool anyone who didn't know her well. "You made it." She kissed the air beside my cheek without touching me, then immediately turned toward another guest before I could answer. I stood there for another moment, smiling politely while my eyes wandered across the living room walls. Framed black and white wedding photos. Pictures from Ethan and Claire's honeymoon in Napa Valley. A large portrait of their golden retriever stretched across a cream-colored sofa. There were even photos of Claire's parents holding champagne glasses in the backyard during construction of the patio. But there was nothing of me. Not one photo from Ethan's childhood. Not one Christmas morning. Not one birthday cake with crooked candles. Not one image of the woman who had spent 38 years raising the man Claire now introduced as self-made. My fingers tightened around the pie dish. Maybe the pictures were somewhere else, I told myself. Maybe upstairs. Maybe they hadn't finished decorating yet. But deep down, I already knew the truth women my age always know. Nothing disappears from a house by accident. "This place is incredible," one of the guests said nearby. "You two really built an amazing life together." Claire laughed softly, brushing her hand against Ethan's arm. "We worked very hard for all of this," she said. "Every inch of this home came from our sacrifices." Ethan nodded quietly beside her, his smile small and tired. He didn't look at me. That hurt more than Claire's words ever could. Because my son knew exactly where the down payment had come from. He knew who emptied her retirement savings after Harold died, so he and Claire could stop renting that tiny apartment over the grocery store. I remembered the cashier's check trembling slightly in my hands the day I gave it to him. "Don't tell Claire I hesitated." I had joked back then. "I want her to think I'm fearless." Ethan had hugged me so tightly that afternoon. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking a little, "I'll never forget this." But standing in that beautiful living room now, surrounded by strangers admiring the life I helped pay for, I realized forgetting was exactly what had happened. Claire walked past me carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses. "Oh," she said suddenly, glancing toward the empty wall above the fireplace. "I still need to find something for that spot." Family photos can make a room feel cluttered sometimes. Several guests nodded in agreement. I looked at the blank wall, then slowly back at her. She smiled pleasantly, but there was something cold hiding underneath it. Something deliberate. And in that moment, with music playing softly in the background and laughter echoing through the house my sacrifices helped build, I understood that Claire hadn't removed my photographs because she disliked me. She removed them because she wanted a version of Ethan's life where I had never existed at all. I spent the next hour pretending nothing was wrong. That is what women from my generation learn to do best. We smile while something breaks quietly inside us. I carried paper plates into the kitchen when Claire asked for help, complimented the marble countertop she had chosen, and laughed softly at stories from people whose names I could barely remember. But the entire time, I kept noticing the walls. Everywhere I looked, there were carefully selected pieces of Ethan's life displayed like exhibits in a museum. His college graduation photo, a framed newspaper clipping from his first promotion downtown, a picture of him and Claire standing in front of the house before renovations began, both of them holding paint rollers and laughing toward the camera. It was a beautiful lie, because I remembered what that house actually looked like the first time Ethan showed it to me. The roof leaked near the back hallway. The kitchen floor dipped slightly near the refrigerator. The upstairs bathroom smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many candles the realtor lit during the showing. Ethan had looked exhausted that afternoon, standing in the driveway with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "It is probably too much for us," he admitted quietly while Claire stayed inside measuring windows for curtains. "We might need to wait another few years." I had looked at my son then and seen the same worried expression he used to wear as a little boy whenever bills piled up after Harold got sick. Ethan always carried stress in his shoulders, even at 10 years old. "How much is the down payment?" I asked him. He hesitated before answering. 2 weeks later, I emptied nearly half my savings account. Not because Ethan asked. He never did. I did it because mothers remember things their children forget. We remember overdue utility notices hidden under couch cushions. We remember buying winter coats one size too big so they would last another year. We remember eating canned soup for dinner so our children could have fresh fruit in their lunchboxes. Sacrifice becomes so natural after enough years that eventually nobody notices it anymore, not even the people who benefited from it most. Margaret, Claire's voice pulled me back into the present. She stood beside the oversized refrigerator arranging imported cheeses onto a serving tray. Would you mind putting these out on the patio? Of course, I said gently. The backyard looked like something from a home design magazine. String lights hung above the fence line. There was a stone fire pit surrounded by white cushioned chairs and tiny potted lavender plants placed carefully on each table. Guests gathered in small groups, sipping wine, while soft jazz played through hidden outdoor speakers. I spotted Ethan near the grill speaking with a man in a navy blazer. My son looked older lately. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone constantly trying to keep balance on unstable ground. Beautiful place, the man beside him said. You and your wife really built something impressive here. Ethan gave a small smile. Claire did most of the vision. The man laughed. Still, it helps having support from family. Ethan glanced down at his drink. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. A flicker of discomfort crossing his face before Claire appeared beside him, smooth and polished as always. Oh. We learned early not to depend on anybody, she said lightly. Everything we have, we earned ourselves. The group nodded approvingly. Someone raised a glass toward them. I stood only a few feet away holding a tray of cheeses no one had touched yet. Ethan looked up then. Our eyes met briefly across the patio lights and soft laughter. I waited for him to correct her. To say something simple. Anything at all. But after a long moment, he just looked away again. And somehow that silence hurt more than if he had denied me himself. Later that evening, I excused myself quietly and stepped back inside the house. The noise from the patio faded behind me, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the low instrumental music Claire always played when guests visited. The kitchen counters gleamed beneath warm pendant lights, untouched and perfect, like a showroom nobody actually lived in. I walked slowly through the hallway, trailing my fingertips across the smooth painted walls while memories kept rising uninvited in my mind. Ethan learning to ride a bicycle at age 7 in the cracked parking lot behind our old apartment building. Ethan sitting at the kitchen table filling out college applications while Harold pretended not to worry about tuition costs. Ethan crying quietly in the hospital chapel after his father passed away. Every version of my son existed inside me. Yet somehow none of those years existed anywhere inside this house. I stopped near the staircase when I noticed a narrow hallway leading toward the garage. The door sat slightly open. A cool draft slipped through the crack, carrying the faint smell of cardboard and fresh cement. I did not know why I walked toward it. Maybe mothers can sense when pieces of themselves have been hidden away. The garage lights flickered on, automatically above me. Most of the space looked organized with labeled storage bins stacked neatly along one wall. Claire had always liked things orderly. But near the far corner, half hidden beneath a folded moving blanket, sat an old cardboard box with black markers scrawled across the side. Miscellaneous photos. My chest tightened before I even touched it. I knelt slowly beside the box and pulled back the blanket. Inside were dozens of framed pictures wrapped loosely in newspaper. Some glass corners had cracked during the move. Others were smudged with dust and fingerprints. The first frame I lifted made my throat ache instantly. It was Ethan at age 5 sitting on Harold's shoulders during a 4th of July parade downtown. I remembered that day clearly because Ethan had dropped melted strawberry ice cream all over Harold's favorite white shirt and cried for 20 minutes thinking he was in trouble. Harold only laughed and bought him another cone. Beneath that photo sat another frame. Ethan at his high school graduation standing between me and Harold with his arms around our shoulders. Then another. Christmas morning. Ethan holding the first bicycle we ever managed to afford. Family vacations. Birthday dinners. School plays. 30 years of memories shoved into a cardboard box and pushed into the corner of a garage beside and used paint cans and extension cords. I stared down at the photographs while something cold settled heavily inside my chest. Not anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This felt quieter than that. Older somehow. Like finally understanding a truth that had been forming slowly for years. Margaret. I looked up sharply. Helen Brooks stood near the garage doorway holding her purse against her coat. Her silver curls shifted slightly in the evening breeze coming from outside. Helen had been my closest friend since our boys played Little League together nearly 30 years ago. She looked from my face down to the open box beside me, and her expression changed immediately. "Oh my goodness," she whispered softly. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Helen stepped closer and carefully lifted one of the photographs from the box. These were hanging in Ethan's old apartment, she said quietly. I nodded once. My voice would not cooperate yet. Helen turned another frame over in her hands before looking back at me. "Did Claire put these out here?" she asked gently. I forced a small smile that felt painfully fragile around the edges. She said family photos make the house feel cluttered. Helen stared at me for several seconds without blinking. Then she looked back into the box filled with pieces of my life. "No," she said quietly. "This is not about clutter." And deep down, I knew she was right. Helen stayed beside me for another minute before someone called her name from the patio. She squeezed my arm gently and whispered, "Do not let them make you feel invisible, Margaret." Then she disappeared back toward the music and laughter outside, leaving me alone in the garage surrounded by pieces of my own life. I sat there quietly for a while after she left. The concrete floor felt cold beneath my knees, but I barely noticed. One by one, I lifted the photographs from the boxes carefully as if they were fragile antiques. Maybe they were. Memories become delicate once the people connected to them start disappearing. At the very bottom of the box, beneath an old winter scarf and a stack of unused picture frames, I found a photo of Harold standing in front of our first house with Ethan in his arms. It was not much of a house. The porch leaned slightly to one side, and the shutters needed paint even back then. But Harold looked proud in that photograph. Proud in the quiet way good men often are. He had worked double shifts at the paper mill for nearly 11 years to afford that little place. I remember how exhausted he used to come home during those years. His boots covered in dust. His shoulders aching so badly some nights he could barely lift his coffee mug. But he never complained in front of Ethan. "The boy deserves stability," he always used to say. "Children should feel safe in their own homes." After Harold died, I stayed in that house alone for nearly 12 years. Long enough for the kitchen wallpaper to fade and the maple tree in the backyard to grow taller than the roofline. Long enough for silence to become its own kind of roommate. Ethan worried about me after the funeral. At least he did in the beginning. He called every night for months asking if I had eaten dinner or remembered to lock the back door. Sometimes he would drive over after work just to sit with me on the porch while we watched thunderstorms roll across the neighborhood. Back then, Claire still acted warm around me. She brought homemade casseroles during the first winter after Harold passed away and insisted on helping me decorate the Christmas tree because she did not want me feeling lonely. I believed her kindness was genuine. Maybe part of it was once. That is the difficult thing about people. Few of them become cruel all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, like watching sunlight disappear across a room 1 inch at a time until suddenly everything is dark. I still remember the afternoon Ethan first showed me this house. Claire walked from room to room speaking excitedly about renovations while Ethan stayed mostly silent beside me. "It is probably irresponsible," he admitted once Claire stepped outside to take a phone call. "We are already stretched thin." I looked around at the stained floors and cracked kitchen cabinets and saw not what the house was, but what it could become for him. Stability, security, a future. The same things Harold worked himself half sick trying to give us. 3 days later, I sat alone at my dining room table staring at my retirement account statement for almost an hour before finally calling the bank. I remember the young teller asking twice if I was sure about withdrawing that amount. I was 66 years old then. Women my age are supposed to protect what little security they have left. But motherhood does not disappear simply because your hair turns gray. Sometimes it gets stronger, more dangerous even. Because once you have spent decades loving someone, helping them feels more natural than helping yourself. I slipped the photograph of Harold and Ethan carefully back into the box and wiped dust gently from the frame with my sleeve. Outside, laughter drifted faintly through the garage walls. Claire's voice rose above the others for a moment, smooth and polished as ever. "We built everything together, she said proudly. I closed my eyes slowly. Because for the first time that night, I realized Claire was not simply erasing photographs. She was erasing debts, sacrifices, history itself. And somehow, my son was allowing her to do it. I finally returned to the party carrying one of the old photographs with me without really thinking about it. It was the picture of Ethan at his college graduation, the one where Harold stood proudly beside him in a navy suit that had become slightly too loose after chemotherapy treatments. I do not know why I held on to that particular frame. Maybe because it captured one of the last genuinely happy days before illness swallowed so much of our lives. The patio had grown louder while I was gone. Several guests gathered near the fire pit now, wrapped in light sweaters against the cool evening air, while Claire moved gracefully between conversations, refilling wine glasses and accepting compliments about the house. She looked completely at ease. That was always Claire's talent. She could stand in the middle of a lie and make everyone else feel awkward for noticing it. Margaret, a woman near the patio door, said warmly as I approached. Claire was just telling us how inspiring it was that they renovated this entire property themselves. Claire smiled modestly and touched Ethan's arm again. It was exhausting, honestly, she laughed. There were weeks we barely slept. But it paid off, another guest added. Young couples today usually depend too much on family money. It is refreshing seeing people build something on their own. The group nodded approvingly. I noticed Ethan take a slow sip from his drink without speaking. His silence had started to develop its own shape tonight. Heavy, cowardly, familiar. Claire glanced toward me then, and her eyes dropped briefly to the framed photograph still in my hands. Something flickered across her expression for half a second before disappearing beneath another polished smile. Oh, she said lightly. You found some of the old pictures. Her tone made it sound accidental, like forgotten holiday decorations tucked away after winter. They were in the garage, I answered. Softly, a strange quiet settled around the group for a moment. Not dramatic, just enough for people to notice something underneath the surface shifting slightly out of place. One of the men near the fire pit leaned closer to look at the frame. That your husband? He asked kindly. I nodded. Harold. He passed away 6 years ago. You can tell he was proud of his son, the man said. Before I could answer, Claire gave a soft laugh. Ethan has always been independent, she said quickly. Even as a teenager, he never liked accepting help from anybody. The words landed carefully, deliberately, like tiny nails tapped slowly into wood. Helen, standing nearby now with folded arms, looked sharply toward Claire but stayed silent. Well, the man replied awkwardly. Everybody needs support sometimes. Claire shrugged one shoulder elegantly. Maybe emotionally, but financially? Ethan and I promised each other early on we would build our own future. I felt the photograph grow heavier in my hands. Around us, glasses clinked softly while music drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Somewhere farther down the patio, somebody laughed loudly at a joke I could not hear. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet suddenly I understood something deeply humiliating. Claire was not embarrassed by what I had contributed. She was embarrassed that I existed at all inside the story she wanted people to believe. In Claire's version of life, successful people appeared fully formed. Beautiful homes arrived through ambition alone. Mothers became inconvenient details once their usefulness expired. I looked toward Ethan one last time, waiting for even the smallest correction. A simple sentence would have been enough. My mother helped us. That was all he needed to say. Instead, he stared down into his whiskey glass while Claire continued speaking smoothly beside him. Everything here came from sacrifice, she told the guests proudly. We earned every inch ourselves. And standing there beneath the soft patio lights while strangers admired the life I quietly helped create, I realized my son was allowing his wife to rewrite our entire history one sentence at a time. The party began winding down. Around 10 o'clock, guests gathered coats from the guest bedroom and carried empty wine glasses toward the kitchen, while Claire stood near the front door thanking everyone for coming in her polished, effortless way. I stayed mostly quiet after the conversation on the patio, not because I was afraid to speak. Some disappointments simply arrive too deep for immediate words. They settle slowly into your bones first. Helen found me standing alone near the dining room table, folding used napkins into neat little squares nobody would ever use again. You should let me drive you home, she said softly. I am fine, I answered automatically. Helen gave me the same look she used to give our boys when they lied about finishing homework. Patient, unconvinced. Margaret, she said quietly, lowering her voice, how long has this been happening? I looked down at the napkin in my hands. The truth was, I did not know exactly. That was the frightening part. Once you start noticing rejection, old memories begin rearranging themselves into clearer shapes. Tiny moments you once excused suddenly return sharper than before. Claire insisting there was not enough room for me at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, even though I later saw photographs online of 12 people crowded comfortably around the table. Ethan forgetting to invite me to their anniversary dinner last spring until Helen mentioned it accidentally over lunch. The framed family portrait Claire mailed as a Christmas card where I had been carefully cropped out because, according to her, the picture looked too busy. At the time, I laughed it off. Women my age are taught to smooth rough edges inside families, to avoid making things uncomfortable, to accept small humiliations quietly so everyone else can keep pretending peace still exists. But standing in that beautiful house tonight, I realized those moments had not been random. They had been rehearsals, slow erasures happening one polite excuse at a time. I think she has been removing me for years, I admitted softly. Helen's face tightened with sadness. Before she could answer, Claire entered the dining room carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. There you two are, she said brightly. Margaret, you do not have to clean anything. You are our guest tonight. The words sounded kind on the surface, but something underneath them felt staged, almost theatrical, as though she wanted Helen to hear how gracious she was being. Claire set the tray onto the counter and glanced briefly at the framed photograph still resting beside my purse. Her smile flickered slightly. You can leave those old pictures here if you want, she said casually. I honestly was not sure what to do with them. Most of them do not really match the style of the house anymore. I looked at her carefully then. Claire was beautiful in the sharp, polished way magazine women often are. Perfect makeup, smooth blonde hair, cream-colored sweater without a wrinkle anywhere. But beneath all that elegance sat something restless, hungry almost, like she needed constant proof that she belonged above everyone else. They are not decorations, I said quietly. They are memories. Claire gave a small shrug. I guess I just prefer cleaner spaces. Less clutter. Helen stared openly at her now, no longer bothering to hide her disapproval. But Claire either did not notice or simply did not care. She walked toward the sink and began rinsing glasses while speaking over her shoulder. Besides, Ethan and I are trying to create our own identity as a family now. You know how it is. Couples need space to build something personal. Something personal. I repeated those words silently in my head while studying the back of my daughter-in-law's perfectly pressed sweater. Suddenly, I understood the real reason my photographs disturbed her so much. Every picture on those walls reminded people that Ethan belonged to someone before he belonged to Claire, that his life did not begin the day she entered it. And for the first time all evening, something inside me stopped hurting and started becoming very, very calm. By the time I left their house, the night air had turned cold enough that my breath fogged faintly against the windshield. I sat inside my car for several minutes without turning the engine on. Ethan and Claire's new house glowed warmly at the end of the driveway, every window lit. Golden against the darkness like something from a holiday catalog. Guests still lingered near the front entrance saying long goodbyes, while soft music drifted outside each time the front door opened. From a distance, it looked like happiness. That is the dangerous thing about appearances. Sometimes the prettier something looks from the outside, the harder people work to hide what is rotting underneath it. I placed the framed photograph carefully on the passenger seat beside me and finally started the car. The drive home took almost 40 minutes, mostly through quiet suburban roads lined with sleeping houses and dark storefronts already closed for the night. I used to enjoy driving at night after Harold died. The silence felt peaceful back then. Tonight it felt different, sharper somehow, like my mind had finally stopped trying to protect me from truths I had avoided for too long. At a red light near Maple Avenue, I suddenly remembered something Claire said nearly 3 years ago while helping me clean after Easter dinner. Family stories can become heavy, she had told me casually while wrapping leftovers in foil. Sometimes people need space to become who they really are. At the time, I thought she meant marriage, independence, growing up. Now I realized she meant separation. Claire did not want Ethan to become his own man. She wanted him disconnected from every person who shaped him before her. By the time I reached my neighborhood, most porch lights had already gone dark. My little white house sat exactly as I left it that afternoon, quiet and modest beneath the oak tree Harold planted the year Ethan turned 12. I unlocked the front door and stepped into familiar stillness. No designer furniture. No expensive lighting. No polished image carefully arranged for strangers. Just my home. The grandfather clock ticking softly near the hallway. The faint smell of lavender hand soap near the kitchen sink. Harold's old reading chair still sitting beside the lamp, no matter how many times people suggested I replace it. I slipped off my shoes and carried the framed photograph into the living room. Every wall there held memories. Ethan missing his 2 front teeth at age 8. Harold grilling hamburgers during summer cookouts. Christmas mornings where wrapping paper covered every inch of the carpet because Ethan always opened presents too fast. None of it matched perfectly. Some frames were crooked. Others faded slightly with time. But every photograph told the truth. I stood there for a long while staring at those walls before finally walking toward the hallway closet. Near the back shelf sat a small fireproof lockbox I had not opened in over a year. I knelt carefully and lifted it onto the dining room table. The metal felt colder than I expected beneath my fingertips. Inside were documents most people would consider boring. Bank statements, retirement paperwork, insurance records, old tax returns, the ordinary paper trail of an ordinary life. But buried near the bottom sat a large white envelope with Ethan's handwriting across the front. MOM, house documents. For a moment, I simply stared at it without moving. Then slowly, I opened the envelope and spread the contents across the table beneath the warm overhead light. Cashier's check copies, transfer receipts, loan agreements, legal correspondence from the title company. Every single document connected to the money I gave Ethan for that house. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair while silence filled the room around me. Because suddenly I understood something Claire never considered. Photographs can be removed from walls. Stories can be rewritten at parties. Memories can even be buried inside garage boxes. But paperwork is different. Paperwork remembers everything. I barely slept that night. The documents remained spread across my dining room table long after midnight, while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Every few hours I walked past the papers again, rereading the same numbers and signatures as if I needed proof that my own memory still existed. There it all was in black ink. The cashier's check for $82,000. The transfer authorization from my retirement account. The letter Ethan wrote thanking me for making the house possible. I had forgotten about that letter entirely. His handwriting looked younger somehow. Softer. I promise. This will never be taken for granted, he wrote near the bottom of the page. I stared at that sentence for a very long time. Around 2 in the morning, I made myself chamomile tea and sat beside the living room window watching rain slide slowly down the glass. I kept thinking about Claire's face whenever guests complimented the house. That proud smile. That careful performance. For years I assumed Claire disliked me because I represented obligation or tradition or the complicated emotions families carry over time. But now I saw something much simpler underneath it all. Claire needed to believe she created Ethan entirely on her own because acknowledging my sacrifices meant admitting she benefited from someone she considered smaller than herself. Some people cannot tolerate debts they did not choose, especially emotional ones. The next morning arrived gray and cold. I moved slowly through the house watering plants, folding laundry, feeding the birds outside the kitchen window. Ordinary routines always calm me after disappointment. By 10 o'clock, sunlight finally pushed weakly through the clouds just as my phone buzzed on the counter. Ethan's name appeared across the screen. For a second, I simply stared at it ringing. Then I answered. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded careful. Too careful. You left pretty quickly last night. I folded a dish towel quietly before answering. It was getting late. A pause settled between us. I could hear faint traffic noises through his phone speaker. Claire thought maybe you seemed upset, he said finally. Not I thought. Claire thought. Even now, he hid behind her observations instead of his own. Did she? I asked softly. Another pause. Mom, he sighed. If this is about the photographs, Claire did not mean anything by it. She is just trying to make the house feel modern. I looked across my living room at the dozens of framed memories covering my walls. Modern. Such a strange word for erasing people. The photographs were in the garage. Ethan. His silence arrived instantly this time. heavy and unmistakable. "We have not finished unpacking everything yet," he answered finally, though his voice lacked conviction now. "I see. Mom, do not make this into something bigger than it is." That sentence settled over me quietly, because suddenly I understood Ethan still believed this was about pictures, about decoration, about feelings. He still had no idea what I actually lost standing in that house last night. "You know," I said calmly, "I found your letter too." "What letter?" "The one you wrote after I transferred the down payment." Silence. Complete silence. Even the traffic sounds disappeared for a moment. Then Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Mom, I kept every document," I continued gently. "Every transfer, every receipt, every signature." His breathing changed slightly on the other end of the line. "Nervous now? Why are we talking about paperwork?" he asked carefully. I walked slowly toward the dining room table and rested my fingertips against the stack of papers still sitting there beneath the morning light. Because paperwork remembers things people try very hard to forget. Neither of us spoke after that. But for the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt invisible. 3 days later, Ethan showed up at my house alone. I saw his car pull into the driveway just after 4 in the afternoon while I was trimming dead leaves from the rose bushes near the porch. The weather had turned cooler since the party. Autumn always arrives quietly in our town, one yellow leaf at a time, until suddenly every tree looks tired. Ethan stepped out of the car slowly, hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. He looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally worn down in the way Harold used to look after long nights balancing overdue bills at the kitchen table. For a moment, seeing my son standing there beneath the oak tree he climbed as a boy almost softened everything inside me again. Almost. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly as he approached the porch. "Hi, sweetheart." I set the gardening shears aside and opened the front door without another word. Ethan followed me into the kitchen where the smell of cinnamon candles and fresh coffee still lingered in the air. He sat down slowly at the dining room table, and I noticed his eyes immediately drift toward the stack of paperwork still, resting neatly beside the lockbox. "Claire is upset," he admitted after a long silence. I poured coffee into 2 mugs before answering. "I imagine she is." Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "She thinks you are trying to embarrass us." I handed him his coffee carefully. "Did I embarrass you, Ethan?" He looked down into the cup instead of answering. Outside, wind brushed softly against the kitchen windows while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Finally, he sighed. "Mom, you know Claire cares a lot about appearances." I almost smiled at that. Such a gentle way to describe cruelty. "And what about you?" I asked quietly. "What do you care about?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since arriving, he looked directly around the room, at the photographs covering every wall. His 8th birthday party, Harold teaching him how to fish at Lake Benton, Christmas mornings, school awards, a lifetime displayed honestly without concern for aesthetics or modern design. "I never noticed before," he said softly. "Noticed what?" His eyes moved slowly across the frames. "How much of my life is here?" Something inside my chest tightened painfully at those words. Because that was the real tragedy of motherhood sometimes. Not sacrifice itself, but how invisible those sacrifices become to the very people they protected. Ethan reached toward the paperwork finally. His fingers hesitated slightly before lifting the old letter he wrote years ago. I watched his face change as he reread his own handwriting. "I forgot about this," he whispered. "I know." Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different. Not defensive, not angry. Just heavy with realization. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair and covered his mouth with one hand the same way Harold always did when regret hit him unexpectedly. "Claire said the photos made the house look crowded," he murmured after a while. I nodded once. "I know what she said." He stared down at the letter for another long moment before speaking again. But I should have stopped it. Those 6 words settled quietly between us. No excuses. No blaming Claire. Just truth. Simple and overdue. I looked at my son then and suddenly saw both versions of him at once. The little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares, and the grown man who stood silently while his wife erased me piece by piece. Both were real. Both belonged to me. Ethan carefully placed the letter back onto the table and glanced toward the photograph beside the lamp near the window. It was the old picture of him sitting on Harold's shoulders during the 4th of July parade. Dad loved that photo, he said softly. He did. Ethan swallowed hard and looked around the room one last time. Claire thought removing your pictures would make the house feel more like ours, he admitted quietly. I folded my hands together calmly in my lap. But some people forget something important, Ethan. He looked up at me slowly. What is that? I glanced toward the walls filled with decades of memories before answering. You cannot erase the person who helped build the life you are standing inside.